Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Today we explore the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, the first time an Asian power defeated a European empire. This is the story of why Russia, vast and powerful, fell before Japan's rising strength. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world believed it already knew the hierarchy of nations. Europe stood tall, its empires stretching across continents, its armies and navies unrivaled. Asia, by contrast, was seen as fractured, colonized, or struggling to modernize. That was the accepted wisdom, until a war erupted on the far edges of Manchuria and Korea that turned assumptions upside down. The Russo-Japanese War was not just another clash of empires. It was the first modern conflict in which an Asian power dared to challenge a European empire and won. The result left Russia fractured, humiliated, and questioning its future. For Japan, the victory confirmed its place among the world's great powers, though the cost of war would soon weigh heavily on its economy and its people. But this story is not merely about treaties or political maneuvers. It is about the shocking spectacle of how a mighty Western superpower, with vast armies and fleets, was brought to its knees by a nation many had dismissed only decades earlier as a feudal, isolated society. It is a story of poor leadership against bold vision, of outdated tactics against modern reforms, and of a clash where determination outweighed numbers. To understand how Japan, once ruled by samurai, defeated the colossal Russian Empire, we must start at the top by examining the leaders entrusted to guide their nations through this war of steel, smoke, and pride. For the Russian Empire, the sea was supposed to be its shield, yet the men entrusted with this shield often proved to be its greatest weakness. At the start of the war, Russia's naval command in the Pacific rested in the hands of Admiral Wilhelm Wittgeft. He was not incompetent, but indecision plagued him. He hesitated at critical moments, giving Japan room to maneuver. His cautious style was cut short at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, where he was killed in action, leaving Russia without a steady hand just as the storm of war gathered. In his place, the empire turned to Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, a man whose fiery temper earned him the nickname Mad Dog. To his men, he was less a commander to be respected than one to be feared. His most infamous moment came not against Japan, but against Britain. In 1904, during the Dogger Bank incident in the North Sea, Rozhestvensky mistook British fishing vessels for Japanese torpedo boats and opened fire. The blunder nearly dragged Britain into war against Russia and denied Rozhestvensky's fleet crucial access to the Suez Canal, forcing a grueling detour around Africa on their way to the Pacific. These missteps were not mere accidents. They revealed a deeper rot in Russian naval leadership. Where clear-eyed vision was needed, there was rashness. Where boldness might have turned the tide, there was hesitation. In the unforgiving theater of naval warfare, every decision echoed across thousands of lives, and Russia's admirals often made the wrong ones. If the Russian Navy suffered from flawed leadership, the army on land fared no better. The Tsar's generals were men caught between fear of failure and an obsession with pride, and both extremes proved disastrous. General Alexei Kuropatkin, Russia's main commander in Manchuria, embodied hesitation. A cautious defensive leader, he avoided risks at all costs. His strategy was one of retreat and delay, stretching battles into attrition. He believed Russia's vast manpower could eventually win. Yet this timidity became a curse. At Liaoyang and later at Mukden, two of the largest battles of the war, Kuropatkin's refusal to seize the initiative left his armies demoralized and vulnerable, handing victory to the Japanese despite their smaller numbers. In contrast stood General Anatoly Stessel, whose flaw was not hesitation, but stubbornness. Stationed at Port Arthur, he received repeated orders to withdraw when the fortress became untenable. But Stessel refused, clinging to the illusion that his defiance could hold back Japan. His obstinacy condemned tens of thousands of soldiers to a futile defense, and when the fortress finally fell after months of brutal siege, Russia lost one of its most strategic positions in East Asia. Together, Kuropatkin and Stessel illustrated the worst of Russia's command, one paralyzed by fear, the other blinded by pride. Neither man could provide the balance of caution and courage that war demanded. Against Japan's sharper, more decisive leadership, these flaws would soon become fatal. While Russia's admirals stumbled between hesitation and recklessness, Japan's navy found its guiding star in Admiral Togo Hachiro. Calm, disciplined, and visionary Togo was more than a warrior, he was a student of the sea. Years earlier, he had studied at the Royal Naval College in Britain, where he absorbed the doctrines of the world's most powerful fleet. He returned to Japan with a belief that mastery of the sea would decide his nation's fate. When war with Russia came, Togo applied these lessons with precision. His leadership at Port Arthur and later at Tsushima revealed a commander who understood not only the mechanics of naval warfare, but its psychology. He knew when to press, when to wait, and how to wield his fleet like a blade rather than a bludgeon. To his men, he was not Mad Dog, or the indecisive one. He was simply the admiral, a title that carried both respect and reverence. Contemporaries often called him the Horatio Nelson of Japan, a comparison not lightly made. Like Nelson, Togo believed in the aggressive use of fleets, in striking first, and in inspiring his sailors through example rather than fear. His victories were not born of luck, but of decades of preparation, discipline, and a deep understanding of how modern ships' gunnery and maneuver could break even the largest of enemies. At sea, Japan did not merely fight Russia, it outthought and outlet it. And at the center of that triumph stood Admiral Togo, the man who turned the Imperial Japanese Navy into a weapon sharper than steel. On land, Japan's generals reflected a blend of old traditions and modern strategy, a fusion that sometimes clashed but more often inspired their troops. Chief among them was General Nogi Maresuke, a figure who seemed carved from the spirit of the samurai age. Nogi believed in personal honor and the willingness to sacrifice for victory. At the siege of Port Arthur, he embodied that ethos, leading relentless assaults against Russian defenses even when the cost in Japanese lives was staggering. His bravery was unquestioned, but his reliance on frontal charges reminiscent of an older style of warfare resulted in horrific casualties. To his soldiers, Nogi was both a source of pride and a reminder of the terrible price of loyalty. Balancing that was General Oyama Iwao, a man of broader horizons. Unlike Nogi, Oyama had traveled widely studying the wars of Europe and even observing battles during the Franco-Prussian War. He understood that discipline and coordination, not just courage, were the keys to modern victory. Under his command, Japanese forces executed complex maneuvers at Liaoyang and Mukden, turning battles that should have favored Russia's larger numbers into decisive Japanese triumphs. Together, Nogi and Oyama symbolized Japan's transformation. The nation had not abandoned the warrior's spirit, it had refined it, combining the endurance and sacrifice of the samurai with the lessons of industrial-age warfare. In this fusion lay Japan's greatest strength, a modern army that fought with ancient conviction. Against Russia's divided and uncertain leadership, this unity of purpose would prove devastating. Russia's defeats in the Crimean War, nearly half a century earlier, had exposed just how outdated the empire's armed forces had become. In the years that followed, reformers in St. Petersburg attempted to modernize the army. They introduced the levy system to accelerate mobilization, shortened the years of compulsory military service, and trimmed the enormous defense budget in hopes of balancing the empire's fragile finances. On paper, these changes seemed sensible. In practice, they sowed the seeds of future disaster. By reducing the service period, millions of peasants cycled quickly through the army and then returned to their villages. Many came back with literacy, new trades, and a newfound awareness of how backward their society was compared to the West. Instead of producing a stronger army, the reforms produced a restless population, men who had seen the empire's inefficiency firsthand. That simmering discontent would later erupt in mutinies and revolution, some of which were already beginning during the Russo-Japanese War itself. Even worse, the cost-cutting measures gutted Russia's ability to train and equip its soldiers. By 1902, the army's budget had been nearly halved, dropping from 30% to just 18% of state spending. When the war began in 1904, Russia was investing barely half of what other major powers were spending per soldier. The result was predictable armies that looked formidable on parade, but crumbled in the field. The irony was cruel. In trying to save money and modernize, Russia had instead weakened its ability to fight. Against a leaner, hungrier, and more disciplined opponent like Japan, these half measures would prove fatal. The weakness of Russian command was matched by the poor training of its rank and file. In theory, the empire could field millions of men. In reality, many of those men marched into battle with outdated tactics and little understanding of modern warfare. The army still clung to volley fire, an old method in which entire lines of soldiers were ordered to fire simultaneously, reloading in unison. It was a tactic better suited to the age of muskets than to the precision of modern rifles. Observers from abroad quickly noticed the problem. General Sir Ian Hamilton, a British officer sent to witness the war, remarked with biting criticism that a Russian soldier might as well just fire blank cartridges if he could not tell where his bullet had struck or what error he had made in aiming. Russian marksmanship was notoriously poor, and their training emphasized obedience over accuracy. The result was predictable on the battlefield. Lines of Russian soldiers often fired blindly, their volleys thundering but largely ineffective. By contrast, Japanese infantry were drilled in precision. Fire encouraged to pick targets carefully and to make every bullet count. In engagements from the Yalu River to Liaoyang, this difference in skill meant that even smaller Japanese units could inflict punishing losses on Russian forces many times their size. What was meant to be Russia's advantage, its numbers, was squandered by the inefficiency of its methods. For the men in the trenches, this was not just a failure of strategy, but a grim reality, poorly trained, poorly led, and sent forward to die against an enemy that fought with sharper discipline and deadlier accuracy. Japan's rise as a military power had not come by accident. Only a generation earlier, the country had been ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, where the sword of the samurai dominated both politics and warfare. But in 1853, American warships forced Japan to open its ports, shattering centuries of isolation. To many, it was a humiliation, but also a wake-up call. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 swept away the old order and replaced it with a government determined to modernize. Japan sent students abroad to study engineering science and military strategy. Foreign advisors from France, Germany, and Britain were invited to train its new army and navy. Within a few decades, the transformation was astonishing. Samurai traditions were not erased but blended with Western practices. The blade gave way to the rifle, and the warrior caste was replaced by an entire nation in arms. One of the most significant steps was the conscription law of 1873. For the first time, service in the imperial army was not a privilege of the warrior elite, but a duty for all men. The results were dramatic. Japan's army, which numbered fewer than 20,000 before conscription doubled in just 2 years. By the turn of the century, it had become a disciplined professional force, organized on modern European lines, yet carrying the spirit of sacrifice from its samurai heritage. This combination of imported knowledge and native resolve created an army unlike any in Asia at the time. To Western observers, Japan had leapt centuries in a single generation. To the Russians, who underestimated their opponent, this modernized force would prove to be far more formidable than anyone had expected. On paper, Russia should have crushed Japan. The empire stretched across 2 continents, commanding vast natural resources, and could call upon millions of conscripts. Its economy, though backward in many ways, was still several times larger than Japan's. If wars were decided by numbers alone, the contest would have ended before it began. Yet numbers can deceive. Russia's enormous army was scattered across an empire so vast that moving troops from Moscow to Manchuria could take weeks, even months. The single-track Trans-Siberian Railway, unfinished and overburdened, choked under the strain of war. Men, weapons, and supplies that looked overwhelming on paper often failed to reach the front in time. Japan, by contrast, embraced its limitations. The nation knew it could not outproduce Russia, so it focused on speed, discipline, and aggressive strategy. Every resource was directed toward the war effort. Soldiers trained for precision, officers studied the latest European doctrines, and the government coordinated with an efficiency Russia simply could not match. This difference between sprawling abundance and streamlined efficiency proved decisive. Russia entered the war as a giant, but one with feet of clay. Japan entered as the underdog, but one sharpened into a blade. And when these two forces clashed, it was not the larger army that prevailed, but the one that could strike faster, harder, and with unity of purpose. When the Russo-Japanese War began, both sides marched to battle with the weapons of a modern age. Russia's infantry carried the Mosin Nagant rifle, a sturdy bolt-action design that was simple, durable, and would remain in service for decades. Japan's soldiers were armed with the Arisaka Type 30, a newer rifle praised for its accuracy and reliability. Neither weapon alone could decide the war, but in the hands of disciplined marksmen, the difference in training made the Japanese rifle far deadlier. Machine guns added another layer of destruction. Russia fielded the Maxim gun, a fearsome weapon capable of spitting out hundreds of rounds per minute. The Japanese relied on the French-designed Hotchkiss, slightly less powerful but still deadly. Once again, the weapons themselves were not drastically different. What mattered was how they were used. Russian commanders often positioned their Maxims poorly, wasting their advantage, while the Japanese integrated their machine guns into coordinated assaults that magnified their impact. At sea, the contest was even more striking. Both empires deployed modern steel battleships bristling with heavy guns and powered by coal-fired engines. Yet how those ships were handled made all the difference. Russia's fleets suffered from poor coordination, outdated tactics, and exhausted crews. Japan's navy under Admiral Togo fought with precision drilled from British naval doctrine. Maneuvers were swift formations tight and gunnery devastatingly accurate. Technologically, Russia and Japan entered the war on near equal footing. But technology is only as effective as the men who wield it. And in this war, it was the Japanese who turned steel and powder into a decisive instrument of victory. If leadership and tactics failed, Russia, logistics doomed it. The empire's armies were vast, but moving them to the front lines was an ordeal. The only artery connecting European Russia to Manchuria was the Trans-Siberian Railway, a single-track line that snaked thousands of miles through frozen wilderness. Every train had to yield to another, every delay multiplied, and every breakdown rippled across the supply chain. It was a railroad designed for peacetime expansion, not for sustaining a modern war. Food, ammunition, and reinforcements trickled east at a pace that could never match Japan's speed. Soldiers at the front often waited weeks for proper supplies, while rifles and shells lay stranded hundreds of miles behind them. Russia's forward garrisons stationed in the Far East after the Boxer Rebellion were little more than hollow shells, under-equipped, undertrained, and unprepared for a determined enemy. Their presence was meant less as a fighting force than as a show of strength, a bluff meant to intimidate Japan. But Japan was not fooled. Its armies landed in Korea and Manchuria with astonishing speed supplied across the sea by efficient transport fleets. Where Russia struggled to bring a single division across Siberia, Japan could deploy entire armies in weeks. In war, speed is often the hidden weapon. Russia had numbers, but its troops arrived too late and too thinly supplied to matter. Japan, though smaller, struck with precision and kept its armies fed, armed, and ready. The Siberian wilderness was as much an enemy to the Tsar as the Japanese army itself, and it was an enemy Russia never overcame. The war began not with a formal declaration, but with fire in the night. On February 8, 1904, Japanese destroyers launched a surprise torpedo attack against the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. The strike was daring, sudden, and symbolized Japan's aggressive strategy. Though the attack was not decisive, the Russian battleships were damaged, but not destroyed. It stunned the world. For the first time, an Asian navy had taken the initiative against a European empire. From that moment, momentum belonged to Japan. Its armies poured into Korea, swiftly securing the peninsula before turning north into Manchuria. Each move was carefully planned. Supply lines across the sea kept the troops provisioned while the navy guarded their advance. Russia, by contrast, reeled. Communication lines across Siberia stuttered, and reinforcements dribbled in too slowly to halt the Japanese tide. What the attack at Port Arthur revealed was more than just Japan's tactical boldness. It was psychological warfare. Russia's aura of invincibility was cracked, and soldiers on both sides knew it. To the Japanese, it proved that their modernization had borne fruit, that they could strike and wound a European empire. To the Russians, it was a chilling reminder that this war would not be won by intimidation alone. The first shots at Port Arthur were only the beginning, but they set the tone. Japan would dictate the tempo, striking hard and fast, while Russia would be forced to react always one step behind. Following the opening strikes, the war on land unfolded in a series of bloody contests that revealed both the strength of Japan's aggression and the weakness of Russia's command. The first major clash came at the Battle of the Yalu River in April 1904. Here, Russia attempted an offensive, but poor coordination doomed the attack. The Japanese met them with discipline and firepower, forcing a humiliating retreat. It was the first time a modern European army had been defeated in open battle by an Asian power, and the symbolism reverberated across the globe. Next came the Battle of Nanshan in May. Russian forces under General Stessel were entrenched on fortified hills. The Japanese launched wave after wave of frontal assaults, suffering horrendous casualties. Yet sheer determination and well-coordinated artillery eventually carried the position. Though a costly victory, it demonstrated Japan's relentless will to press forward regardless of the price. The campaign then turned to the siege of Port Arthur. From July 1904 to January 1905, General Nogi's army battered the fortress in a brutal struggle that cost tens of thousands of lives. Japanese soldiers advanced through mud-barbed wire and machine gun fire, often at bayonet range. At last, starvation and exhaustion forced the Russians to surrender. The fall of Port Arthur was not only a strategic disaster for Russia, but also a crushing blow to morale. Meanwhile, in the open fields of Manchuria, the Battle of Liaoyang in August and the Battle of Shaho in October continued the pattern. Russian troops, though often more numerous, were outmaneuvered and outfought by Japanese forces under General Oyama. At Liaoyang, Russia's Kuropatkin commanded twice as many soldiers, yet Japan forced him into retreat. At Shaho, the Russians again suffered devastating losses while the Japanese held their ground. Each of these battles told the same story: a lumbering empire unable to coordinate its vast resources, and a rising nation fighting with precision, speed, and unbreakable determination. By the end of 1904, it was clear that Russia's dream of a swift victory had turned into a nightmare. By early 1905, Russia still clung to the belief that sheer numbers could turn the tide. That belief was tested at Mukden, one of the largest land battles the world had ever seen. Stretching over 3 weeks, it drew nearly 600,000 men into the frozen fields of Manchuria, an entire city of soldiers locked in combat. General Kuropatkin commanded the Russian side, determined at last to halt Japan's advance. Facing him was General Oyama Iwao, who, though outnumbered, orchestrated his armies with calm precision. Where Kuropatkin relied on static defenses, Oyama spread his forces in sweeping maneuvers, striking at Russian flanks and stretching their lines thinner with each passing day. The fighting was brutal. Trenches filled with corpses, artillery thundered without pause, and bayonet charges left fields littered with the dead. Both armies endured unimaginable suffering. Yet the imbalance of leadership became clear. Kuropatkin hesitated at critical moments, issuing contradictory orders that confused his men. Oyama pressed relentlessly, exploiting every weakness. When the battle finally ended in March 1905, Russia had lost over 90,000 men and was forced into a chaotic retreat. Mukden was more than a defeat, it was a collapse. The myth of Russia's invincibility lay in ruins, and the empire's grip on Manchuria was broken. For Japan, Mukden was both a triumph and a tragedy. The victory proved that discipline and strategy could overcome size and numbers, but the cost tens of thousands of Japanese lives reminded the nation that even victory demanded a heavy price. Still, the message to the world was unmistakable. Russia, the colossus of the North, had been humbled in open battle by an Asian power. The war was not yet over, but after Mukden, its outcome was already being written. If Mukden shattered Russia's armies on land, the Battle of Tsushima destroyed its hopes at sea. In May 1905, after a grueling 18,000-mile journey around Africa, Admiral Rozhdestvensky's Baltic fleet finally reached the waters near Japan. Exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized, the fleet steamed into the Tsushima Strait, where Admiral Togo lay in wait. What followed was annihilation. Using precision maneuvers modeled after the British Navy, Togo executed the famous crossing of the T, bringing his ships broadside against the Russian line. Japanese gunnery was devastatingly accurate. Within hours, Russian battleships were burning, sinking, or scattering in chaos. By the end of the battle, out of Russia's 38 ships, only a handful managed to limp to safety. The Japanese lost just 3 small vessels and fewer than 200 men. The Russians, by contrast, suffered over 4,000 dead and saw nearly their entire fleet erased from existence. Tsushima was more than a military defeat. It was a humiliation on a global stage. For centuries, Europe had dominated the seas. Now, for the first time, an Asian power had destroyed a European fleet in a decisive battle. The shock rippled through capitals worldwide. Crippled on land and shattered at sea, Russia had no choice but to sue for peace. With U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt mediating, both nations signed the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905. Japan emerged recognized as a major world power, its influence over Korea and Manchuria confirmed. Russia, humiliated and weakened, turned inward, its defeat fueling unrest that would erupt in revolution just 12 years later. The Russo-Japanese War ended as it began with the unexpected. A rising Asian empire had humbled a European giant, reshaping the balance of power in the modern world. And as soldiers buried their dead on the fields of Manchuria and sailors' bodies washed ashore in Tsushima, the age-old certainty of Western dominance no longer seemed so certain.